This is my new Patreon series, number 44. We're going to talk about the Gospel of Peter, which seems to preserve a Jewish Christian passion narrative that may have predated the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and is very unique. So what is the Gospel of Peter? The Gospel of Peter was first discovered in 1886 by an archaeologist named Urbain Bouillon in the modern Egyptian city of Akhmim, where the Coptic Akhmimic language developed. The manuscript, which was found in the tomb of a monk, is dated to about the 8th or 9th century AD. However, it was a copy of a writing known to the early church fathers that, according to scholars, either predated the canonical Gospels or was composed in the 2nd century. From the passion narrative it transmits, and that's basically what the content is that we have that remains of this document, it seems to have been a complete gospel like Mark, but whether it was a narrative similar to the canonical Gospels or simply a passion narrative cannot be determined from what survives. The passion narrative is the story of Jesus' capture and arrest and trial and crucifixion and resurrection. It was a very early chunk of oral Jesus history that existed soon after the execution of Yeshua. Now I'm quoting, two other papyrus fragments from Oxyrhynchus were discovered later and published in 1972, and they are possibly, but not conclusively, from the Gospel of Peter, and would suggest, if they belonged to that gospel, that the text was more than just a passion narrative. And it's usually considered to be, quote, one of four early non-canonical narrative gospels which exist only in fragmentary form. This Gospel of Peter, the Egerton Gospel, and the two very fragmentary Oxyrhynchus Gospels from Papyruses 840 and 1224. And I'm giving you a link here in Wikipedia. Just search for the Gospel of Peter. You'll get a lot more information. Good articles. Whenever there are good articles in Wikipedia, and many of them are quite good and well documented, then I will give them to you as links. The Passion narrative is unique in many details, including its description of the resurrected Jesus emerging from the tomb, being supported by two huge angels and a talking cross. I'm quoting now from the Gospel of Peter, that section. They see three males who have come out from the sepulchre, with the two supporting the other one, and a cross following them, and the head of the two reaching unto heaven, but that of the one being led out by a hand by them, going beyond the heavens. And they were hearing a voice from the heavens saying, Have you made proclamation to the fallen asleep? And an obeisance was heard from the cross, Yes. So this is a very interesting passage because it's using the Markan historic koine, historic present tense, which sounds kind of ignorance when you read it. They don't say they saw three males. They see three males doing this, and they are hearing a voice from the heavens saying, and so on. That's called the historic present. That's a specific characteristic of the kind of Koine Greek that Mark's gospel was written with, as opposed to the much more sophisticated Greek of say, Luke and so on. Now, the Gospel of Peter is valued as the earliest version of an Aramaic Jewish Christian gospel that has been recovered. Now, it's not in Aramaic, it's in Greek. And its passion narrative was possibly the model for the version in Mark's Gospel, which was written somewhere around AD 55 to 65, that was elaborated later in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, which were composed a generation after the Roman destruction of the temple in AD 70. So it may contain some very early parts, but we'll have to carefully tease them out and see just exactly what they are. So to begin, let's look at what the church fathers of the early Christian centuries had to say about the Gospel of Peter. Most scholars think the 8th and 9th century copy of Peter that was recovered by Bourriant reflects an ancient 2nd century version. However, the dating of Peter depends on whether the text used in the liturgy by the church at Rosas and condemned by Serapion, Patriarch of Antioch in the late 2nd century, is the same Gospel of Peter that's been recovered. So the Patriarch condemned their Gospel that they were using as being docetic, and we'll talk a little more about that later, and he called it the Gospel of Peter. And so although there isn't really much that we can find in the Gospel of Peter that's docetic, except maybe the idea that Yeshua showed and experienced no pain on the cross and that sort of thing. So we think that possibly that was what bothered him, that along with the unusual story about the talking cross, which we're going to look at. So we can date it as early as the 2nd century because it's mentioned at that time and condemned by Serapion. But most scholars date Peter to the first half of the 2nd century and consider to reflect oral Jesus traditions still being transmitted in that period because its narrative is independent of the stories in the Greek synoptic gospels, that is the Passion narrative in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and the Johannine version in the Gospel of John. Now, Jean-Dominique Crossan, who's a very fine scholar, disagrees with the scholarly consensus. He calls Peter the Cross Gospel and thinks it was composed in Aramaic before the Synoptic Gospels and survived as an independent Jewish Christian Passion narrative. I could not agree with the idea that it was composed in Aramaic because it does not have any evidence of Aramaisms in the Greek version that we now have. It looks like it was probably composed in Greek. However, Origen said that the Gospel of Peter agreed with the tradition of the Hebrews, to quote him, meaning the Aramaic-speaking Jewish Christian Gospels, which lends some credence to Crossan's view of its antiquity. However, I would say that would have to do with the oral Jesus traditions that were kept on in those churches rather than with some written document that would be a source like Mark was and Q was and so on. So most scholars agree that the Gospel of the Hebrews, which is also referred to by the Church Fathers as the Gospel of Peter, and the Gospel of the Apostles, and the Gospel of the Nazarenes, and the Gospel of the Ebionites, and the Gospel of the Egyptians, that all these were essentially variations of the same work that was circulated through many of the early Christian churches. And ask you to confirm my previous presentation on the Gospel of the Ebionites, where I go in a lot of detail into this business of the Gospel of the Hebrews and so on. Now, Theodoret, who was a theologian of the school of Antioch and a biblical commentator and a Christian bishop of Cyrrhus in the 5th century, wrote that the Nazarenes, who used what was known as the Gospel of the Hebrews, made use of the Gospel of Peter. So that's another reference to the Gospel of Peter. There are others. The Church Fathers generally agreed that the Nazarene Gospel was commonly called the Gospel of the Hebrews, and that it was used by the Ebionites, whom we have also transmitted parts of Peter that were consistent with their doctrines. Ebionites, for example, you might remember from the previous presentation, did not include what we have in the first 2 chapters of Matthew about the infancy narratives of Jesus' birth and so on. They begin their story with John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus because they didn't accept the idea of virgin birth and a divine nativity and so on. And so they transmitted only what they felt made sense in terms of their understandings, and their understandings were basically Jewish. Now, our focus here will be on details of the ancient passion narrative that's transmitted in the Gospel of Peter, and how and where it might have originated in the oral Jesus traditions, and whether elements of it might underlie the passion narrative in the Gospel of Mark. So how does this Akhmim manuscript of Peter compare with the Synoptics? So we'll start by looking at the text. It begins and says in the very first part, and I'm using a translation that's divided into sections because it makes it easier for me to present this to you. Section 1, but of the Jews none washed his hands, neither Herod nor anyone of his judges. That's very significant because, of course, Pilate washes his hands to say he's not guilty of this. And when they had refused to wash them, Pilate rose up, and then Herod the king commanded that the Lord be taken, saying to them, whatever things I commanded you to do unto him, do. Well, Pontius Pilate in the Gospel of Peter is exonerated of all responsibility for the crucifixion, which is not true in the Synoptic Gospels. The blame is instead laid upon Herod, the scribes and other Jews who pointedly do not wash their hands to cleanse themselves from moral guilt to fulfill Torah as Pilate had done. For example, in Matthew 27, when Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. See ye to it. Then answered all the people and said, his blood be on us and on our children. And of course, that is one of the bases of Christian anti-Semitism. Jews are guilty of deicide, of crucifying and killing God, killing Christ. Yeah, in fact, the mother of Jesus is known today in Orthodox traditions as the Theotokos, the one who carried or gave birth to God. Now, according to Peter, the Gospel of Peter, Herod convicts Jesus, not Pilate, as in the Gentile Synoptics. It was his troops, Herod's troops, who tortured and crucified Jesus. So that's quite a different kind of a detail. Herod was especially hated by Jews, which might indicate that Peter transmitted a Jewish Christian version of the Passion narrative that was either prior to the Gentile version or a revision of the Synoptics, especially Matthew. And that's what we don't really know of. Certainly the Greek version was written after the very early time that these Gospels had appeared, but they were not used as a source. There was some other tradition underlying them that was used, probably an oral tradition, as some scholars think. In Luke's Gospel, Herod is presented a little less negatively. In Luke 23, now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he was of a long time desirous to see him, because he had heard concerning him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. So Herod's interest in Jesus, remember Herod is the fellow who beheads John the Baptist, but here is the fellow who is hoping to see some miracle done by him, a much more positive presentation of Herod than we find certainly in the Gospel of Peter. And the second section goes on, and there was standing there Joseph, the friend of Pilate, and by Joseph it means Joseph Arimathea, the friend of Pilate and of the Lord. And knowing that they were about to crucify him, he came to Pilate and asked the body of the Lord for burial. And Pilate sent to Herod and asked his body. And Herod said, Brother Pilate, even if no one had asked for him, we purpose to bury him, especially as the Sabbath draweth on. For it is written in the law that the sun set not upon one that hath been put to death. A couple of comments here. Joseph of Arimathea in the Passion narrative that we know from the canonical Gospels does not ask for the body until after Jesus is crucified. But here, knowing in advance that it's going to happen, he asks Pilate, and he's friendly with Pilate. He has good relations with Pilate. Now, Joseph of Arimathea is represented as a friend of Pilate, and he asked for the body before the crucifixion, not after, as in the Synoptics. And so here, Pilate is somewhat a friend of the Jews, but Herod, who beheaded John the Baptist, is an enemy. And we can go back to Matthew 27, his version, which recapitulates the versions in Mark, and this is very similar to that in Luke. He says, when the even was come, that is when the sun was setting, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Jesus' disciple. He went to Pilate and begged the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded, Jesus had been crucified and the sun was going to go down. When the sun set, that was the beginning of the next day, Friday night. When the sun goes down, it's the beginning of the Sabbath. So then Pilate commanded the body to be delivered. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. Now, in the story that you're familiar with, Joseph receives the body of Jesus, wraps it in a clean linen cloth, and lays it in his own tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock for himself. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. So Peter's passion narrative, as we're beginning to see, is quite independent of the synoptics. In the third section, and he, Herod, delivered him to the people on the day before the unleavened bread, their feast. And they took the Lord and pushed him as they ran and said, let us drag away the Son of God, having obtained power over him. And they clothed him with purple and set him on the seat of judgment, saying, judge righteously, O King of Israel. And one of them brought a crown of thorns and put it on the head of the Lord, and others stood and spat in his eyes, and others smote his cheeks, others pricked him with a reed, and some scourged him, saying, with this honor, let us honor the Son of God. To scourge means to whip. Now, in Mark and the Synoptic Gospel, it's the soldiers who torture and mock Jesus. And then these are the soldiers of Pilate. It's not the Jews, as in Peter, where the Jerusalem Jews who persecuted the Messianic Jewish Christians are even more severely blamed for the crucifixion. So this is the Jewish Christians are very severely rejected and persecuted and arrested and all kinds of things by the leaders of the temple and in Jerusalem, the Pharisees and the Sadducees in that area. And so there's a great deal of hostility towards them. And so in this account, they have the people themselves of Jerusalem and the religious people and all the rest of them out there are the ones who have crucified and tortured and done all the things to Jesus that the other Gospels say the soldiers did. Now going back to the 27th chapter of Matthew again, then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers, and they stripped him and put on him a scarlet robe, and when they had plaited a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and they spit upon him. So these activities are now all blamed upon the people of Jerusalem and their religious leaders. So actually, in the Synoptic Gospels, they to some extent exonerate the Romans for the crucifixion because they say it's really the Sanhedrin and the Jewish Pharisees and the Sadducees who wanted Jesus dead, and Herod who wanted him dead. But in this story here, it's not the soldiers who do this, and they're not the soldiers of Herod. It's a very different story. This fourth section, and they brought two malefactors, and they crucified the Lord between them. But he, Jesus, held his peace as though having no pain. That is probably the thing that the bishop objected to in using this gospel and this reading, because it would indicate that either he didn't experience the torture on the cross, or that some other being did it for him. The docetic view idea was that Jesus was totally divine. He wasn't human. And so he didn't leave footprints behind, and he could walk on water and all that stuff. And in the crucifixion, the illusion was created that Jesus was carrying the cross and being crucified. But in fact, that was another person who bore the cross and was crucified, and Jesus stood alongside or back out of the vision of people laughing when this happened. And that was the docetic view. And so the idea that he felt no pain on the cross is probably what was considered to be docetic. And when they had raised the cross, they wrote the title, "This is the King of Israel." And having set his garments before him, they parted them among them. Now they're going. This Peter's passion narrative is going to the standard Psalm 22 messianic prophecies about a crucified Messiah that were being used by the early Christians to counter the rabbinic accusations that Yeshua was a malefactor because he was crucified. He was hung upon a tree, because in the Torah it says, "Let him who is accursed by God be hung upon a tree." So therefore Jesus was accursed by God, and they're saying no. They were saying there is no prophecy of a Messiah to be crucified. And these people, or the Christians, are saying, well, yes, look at Psalm 22. It says that they will part his garments and cast lots for them, and so on. And one of those malefactors reproached them, saying, "We, for the evils that we have done, have suffered thus. But this man, who hath become the Savior of men, what wrong hath he done to you?" And they, being angered at him, commanded that his legs should not be broken, that he might die in torment. So let's deconstruct this for a moment. As I say, the story of the two thieves crucified with Jesus is merely a one-sentence allusion in Mark's gospel that's been very expanded and elaborated in Luke, and the release of Barabbas is added in Matthew. So it starts out with just the idea that Jesus is crucified with a couple of other criminals. But then it becomes very well expanded. Well, here it's expanded even farther, because one of the malefactors says that we're being crucified for the evils that we have done, but this man is a savior of men and has not done any wrong. And so they're angry, and therefore they commanded that his legs should not be broken, so he would die in torment. Now, what does that mean? Well, first, let's look at having no pain. I mentioned that this detail, which is not a synoptic detail, was a basis for declaring Peter to be a docetic gospel. And the Shroud of Turin, which I accept as historical evidence, and I put that out in other presentations why, reveals a man suffering very peacefully. His face is not in torture, and as he's buried with the linen cloth. Jesus' legs were reported as unbroken according to gospel accounts. Again, that's a reference to Psalm 34:20, and John 19:36 references that. And is also shown in the shroud. The man in the shroud did not have his legs broken. Now, why is that a big deal? Because the Roman executioners broke legs only to hasten death. But so if a person's legs were broken, they could no longer push up against the nails, and they would asphyxiate and die much more quickly. But usually they left the legs unbroken because that prolonged the torture. And the torture could last for several days. So that when people were on the cross, they could have been on it for 2 days or some long period. Well, in this case, the Sabbath is coming at sunset. The body has to be removed before that time. So the reason that they left, that they did not break the legs of the thief who witnessed for Jesus, was so that he would die in torment. And that was why Jesus' legs were not broken, is that they wanted him to die in torment. And yet look at the face on the shroud. This is a man who's risen above pain. So for scientific research on the Shroud of Turin, I give you this reference. It's just simple shroud.com reference, and it's all kept very up to date, and there's an awful lot of really important evidence about this.